The call came on a Tuesday morning in November, and I remember exactly where I was standing when I got it. In the parking lot of a Tim Hortons off Highway 17, just outside Sudbury, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, breath turning to fog in the cold air. My wife Claire's name was still on my phone screen when I answered. It wasn't Claire calling, though. It was a nurse from Health Sciences North who told me, in the careful, measured tone that medical people use when they've had to say impossible things too many times, that Claire had collapsed at work 40 minutes ago. Subarachnoid hemorrhage. A blood vessel in her brain had ruptured without warning. She was 34 years old. She was already gone by the time I arrived. Claire Anne Bouchard, 34, kindergarten teacher at École Sacré-Cœur. She had packed lunches for our 2 daughters that morning, Sophie, who was 6, and Margot, who had just turned 4. She'd cut Sophie's sandwich into triangles because Sophie had recently decided squares were unacceptable. She'd put a little sticky note in Margot's lunchbox with a drawing of a cat because Margot was obsessed with cats that month. I found those 2 lunchboxes on the kitchen counter when I got home from the hospital. I couldn't move them for 3 days. I don't know how I drove home that afternoon. I don't know how I picked up the girls from my neighbor Helen's place, where they'd been dropped after school. I don't know how I sat Sophie and Margot down on the couch and found words. Sophie cried immediately, in this raw animal way that I'd never heard from her before. Margot didn't cry at all. She asked if Mayman was going to miss her cat drawing, and I had to leave the room for a moment. The following week was a blur of phone calls and paperwork, and the specific, exhausting kindness of people who don't know what to say but keep showing up anyway. Claire's parents, her father Gil Bouchard, 68, a retired electrician, and her mother Paulette, 65, who'd spent 30 years running the office at a local construction company, drove down from Kapuskasing the day after I called them. Gilles arrived with his hands shaking and his eyes red, and he hugged me in the doorway for a long time without saying anything. Paulette went straight to the kitchen and started making soup. They stayed for 2 weeks. They slept on the pull-out couch. They took Sophie to school every morning and picked her up every afternoon and entertained Margot during the in-between hours, while I tried to figure out what a funeral looked like and what a will meant and how a 36-year-old man with a government surveying job and 2 small daughters was supposed to keep any of it together. I called my own parents on the evening after Claire died. My father, Thomas, 61 at the time, was a property developer based out of Oakville. My mother, Patricia, 59, had never really worked. She'd spent her adult life managing the household, managing my father, and managing the image that the 2 of them projected to the people they considered worth impressing. They had a house in Oakville with a 3-car garage and a cottage on Lake Joseph and opinions about everything. My father answered. I told him Claire was gone. There was a silence, and then he said he was sorry to hear that, and then, I want to be very precise about this, because I've replayed it many times. He asked me what I was planning to do about childcare. Not how are the girls. Not how are you. What are you planning to do about childcare? I told him I didn't know yet. I told him I'd just found out 12 hours ago that my wife was dead. He said that made sense, and that I should probably start looking into options sooner rather than later because good daycares had waiting lists. Then my mother came on the line and said she was so sorry and that Claire had been a lovely woman in the past tense, the way you'd describe a painting you'd seen once at a gallery. I asked if they could come up to Sudbury, even for a few days. My mother said they'd love to, but they had the Miller's anniversary dinner that weekend, and the following week Thomas had contractors coming in to start the kitchen renovation, and it just wasn't a good time. She said it in a tone that suggested the timing was a minor inconvenience, like a flight delay. She said I should let them know about the funeral arrangements and they'd see if they could make it work. They sent flowers to the funeral. They did not come to the funeral. After Gilles and Paulette went back to Kapuskasing, I spent 3 weeks trying to manage alone. I was working part-time because my bereavement leave had run out and we needed the income. I had Sophie in grade 1 and Margot in a daycare that cost more per month than I'd budgeted for when Claire was still alive and contributing her teacher's salary. I was cooking meals. I was barely eating and doing laundry at 11 at night and sitting in the car in the driveway sometimes just to have 5 minutes where nobody needed anything from me. One evening in December, Sophie asked me when Mayman was coming back, and I realized I hadn't explained it well enough the first time, or she hadn't been ready to understand it, and I had to do it all over again. I sat on the bathroom floor with both girls for an hour afterward. Margot fell asleep against my shoulder. Sophie kept asking the same question in different ways. But why did her brain break? Was it because she was too tired? Did it hurt? I didn't sleep at all that night. I called my parents again in mid-December. I told my father I was struggling. I told him the girls needed more stability than I could give them alone right now. I asked if they'd consider coming up, or if we could come to them for a while, just to get through the winter. He said he understood it was hard. He said he and Patricia had talked about it. He said they weren't really set up for young children anymore. Sophie and Margot's noise and energy would be too much disruption. And besides, Oakville was far from the girls' school and Margot's daycare, and logistically, it just didn't make sense. He said I should look into whether the government had any support programs for single parents. He said, "They're your granddaughters." He said, "We know that, and we love them, but we have to be realistic about what we can handle." I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I called Gilles. I didn't even get through my first sentence before he stopped me. He said, "You come here, both of you, all three of you. You come up whenever you're ready, and you stay as long as you need." He didn't ask about logistics. He didn't mention disruption. He just said, "Come." I drove up to Kapuskasing on a Friday in January with the girls in the back seat and our dog, an aging beagle named Chester, taking up half the cargo space. It's a 4.5-hour drive north of Sudbury in good weather. In January, with snow, it took nearly 7 hours. We pulled into Gilles and Paulette's driveway at 8:30 at night, and Paulette was at the door before I'd turned the engine off, coat on, arms open. She had made up the 2 spare rooms. Sophie's had a little string of lights around the window that Paulette had put up because she knew Sophie liked them. Margot's had a stuffed cat on the pillow. I stood in the hallway with my coat still on, and I didn't say anything for a moment. Gilles put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You're here now, that's enough for tonight." It was supposed to be a few months. It turned into 2.5 years. Kapuskasing is a small city, about 8,000 people, in northern Ontario, pulp and paper country, the kind of place where people know each other and where the winters are long and serious. I'd always lived further south, and I'd assumed I'd go back to Sudbury eventually, to my job and my house, and whatever version of normal life I could piece together. But something shifted that first spring. Gilles had 20 acres of land on the edge of town that he'd never done much with. He'd kept a small vegetable garden and some chickens, but most of it sat idle. One evening in March, he and I were sitting at the kitchen table after the girls had gone to bed, and he said he'd been thinking about the land. He said a friend of his had suggested maple syrup production. There were enough sugar maples on the property to make it viable, and the startup costs weren't as high as people assumed if you went in slowly and were willing to do most of the work yourself. I'd never tapped a maple tree in my life. I'd never run anything close to a business. My background was land surveying. I understood property boundaries and topographic maps, not sap buckets and evaporators. I told Gilles that. He shrugged. He said he didn't know anything about it either, but he knew people who did. And he was willing to put in the land and what money he had saved, and I could put in the labor and figure out the rest. He said it mattered to him that I had something of my own. He said Claire would have wanted that. That last part undid me a little. I had to look away for a moment. We spent the rest of that winter reading everything we could find. We went to a Maple Producers Association meeting in Hearst and met a man named Earl, 70 years old, who'd been running a sugar bush operation for 4 decades and was willing to teach us what he knew in exchange for help with the heavy lifting that his knees no longer managed. We started small, a few hundred taps, a second-hand evaporator, a lot of trial and error and mistakes that were expensive in ways that hurt, but not in ways that broke us. Paulette kept the girls during the long days of sugaring season, which runs from late February through April when the sap runs. Sophie started at the local elementary school, where she found a best friend named Océane within the first month. Margot, too young for school yet, followed Paulette around the house like a small, serious shadow, helping with the garden and the chickens, and absorbing Paulette's complete, uncomplicated attention in a way that seemed to be doing her genuine good. I watched my daughters coming back to themselves, slowly the way the land comes back in spring. Not all at once, not dramatically, just incrementally, and then one day you notice that things are green again. I'm not going to pretend the grief went away. It didn't. There were nights when the weight of it was unbearable, and I'd walk out to the sugar bush in the dark, just to be somewhere that didn't have Claire's absence in every corner of it. There were moments when I'd reach for my phone to tell her something funny that happened, and hit the same wall every time. Sophie had nightmares for most of that first year. Margot developed a habit of drawing pictures of our family that always included Mayman, hovering slightly above everyone else, like she was watching from a height. But we were not alone, that was the difference. We were not alone. By the second year, we'd expanded to nearly 2,000 taps. By the third year, we had a small retail operation, a roadside sugar shack that Jill and I built together over one summer, selling our own syrup and Paulette's baking, which people drove significant distances for, because Paulette made a butter tart that I maintain is the best thing I've ever eaten. We developed a relationship with a distributor in Timmins who moved our bulk syrup to grocery stores and restaurants across northern Ontario. I filed to transfer my land surveying license to operate as an independent contractor and started picking up part-time contract work around the region, which gave us a second income stream and let me use skills I'd spent years building. Between the surveying and the sugar bush, we were doing better than I'd been doing in Sudbury with 2 incomes. I bought out the mortgage on my house in Sudbury and sold it, and I used part of that money to put toward the operation, and part of it to set up education accounts for Sophie and Margot. Jill turned 70 the year we hit our 4th full season, and I sat with him one evening and told him I wanted to restructure things. He'd put in the land and the initial capital. I wanted him to have an actual ownership stake in what we'd built, formalized, on paper, through a proper partnership agreement. He tried to wave it off, said the land was always going to go to the girls anyway, said he wasn't thinking about it like that. I told him that was exactly why I needed to do it properly, because he wasn't the kind of person who would ask for what he deserved, and that meant I had to make sure he got it anyway. We brought in a lawyer in Timmins and drew up the documents. Jill and Paulette held 40% of the business. I held 60. Whatever the business was worth, they were entitled to their portion. Paulette cried when we signed. Jill pretended not to notice that she was crying, which is something I'd learned was his way of managing his own emotions in situations that threatened to overwhelm him. I did not tell my parents about the business. I had not spoken to my parents more than a handful of times in 4 years, birthday calls, mostly, and even those had tapered off. My father called once to tell me about a property deal he'd done in Mississauga that he seemed to think I'd be interested in. My mother sent Christmas cards with a check inside for the girls every year that was sized, I noticed, to seem generous without being meaningful. I cashed the checks and put them in the girls' education accounts and didn't write back. Life continued. Sophie, by 11, had become a serious and slightly terrifying cross-country skier who represented her school at regional competitions, and had inherited exactly none of my athletic talent and all of Claire's stubborn focus. Margot, who was 9, had decided she wanted to be a veterinarian and had extended this ambition to treating every animal within reach, including Chester the Beagle, who submitted to her examinations with the resigned patience of an old dog, who has learned that there are worse things than being wrapped in a dish towel and having your ears assessed. We had become something that I hadn't had a name for, at first, not just a family. Something more intentional than that. Gilles and Paulette were not filling in for someone else, they were themselves, fully, and the girls knew them that way. Margot called Paulette Mamie within her first year in Kapuskasing and had never stopped. Sophie called Gilles Pépère and consulted him on matters of great importance, like whether she could get a second dog and what to do about a boy in her class who kept copying her homework. What Gilles and Paulette gave us was not a substitute for what we'd lost. It was something different and its own. I understood that by year 4, and I was grateful for it in a way that I didn't yet know how to properly express. Then, 6 months after our 5th full sugaring season, I got a call from a company based in Ottawa. They were a specialty food brand, high-end grocery and gift market, national distribution, and they'd been watching the artisan maple sector for potential acquisitions. Someone had found us through our distributor in Timmins. They wanted to talk. What followed was 8 months of due diligence and negotiations and conversations with lawyers and accountants that made my head swim. I will not pretend I navigated it gracefully. I called Earl, our neighbor who'd taught us everything, more than once just to talk it through with someone who understood what we'd built and what we might be giving up. I talked to Gilles every evening. I walked the sugar bush alone a lot. In the end, the number they put forward was real and significant, and after the lawyers took their portion and the taxes were settled and Gilles and Paulette received their 40%, I was left with a sum that I want to be careful about describing, precisely because I'm not trying to make this about money. What I'll say is that it was enough to change what was possible, for Sophie and Margot's futures, for mine, for Gilles and Paulette's, who were now in their early 70s and had spent their savings and their land and 5 of their best remaining years helping me raise my children. I structured Gilles and Paulette's portion so that it came to them directly, properly, cleanly, not through me and not contingent on anything. Their financial advisor in Kapuskasing helped them set it up in a way that would be tax efficient and sustainable. I also sat with them before the sale closed and told them I wanted to buy them a property. They had been renting a smaller place since selling the original 20 acres into the deal. I wanted them to own something outright, somewhere they chose, somewhere that belonged to them and would continue to belong to them, regardless of what happened to me or to the business or to anything else. Paulette said that was too much. I said it was not enough, and we both knew it. Gilles stared at the wall for a moment and then said quietly that Claire would have been proud of me. I didn't say anything for a while after that. I found out my parents knew because my mother called. I don't know how she heard. Possibly through some real estate or business circle where my father moved. The sale had generated some regional press coverage in the Northern Ontario business community. Possibly through someone who knew someone. It had been by then nearly 5 years since I'd moved to Kapuskasing. My mother's call came on a Thursday afternoon. I was in the driveway helping Margot with a science project involving baking soda and vinegar, which she was treating with the seriousness of actual research. My mother said it had been too long and she'd been thinking about me and the girls. She said she'd heard I'd had some success with a business venture and that she and Thomas were so proud of me. She said they'd love to come up and visit, maybe spend some time getting to know Sophie and Margot properly. She said properly, like it was a slight grammatical error in someone else's sentence, a word that didn't quite account for the fact that Sophie was now 11 and had spent 5 years without her grandparents knowing her at all. I told her I'd think about it. My father called 2 days later. He was more direct, which I'll give him. He always was. He said they'd made mistakes after Claire died, that they hadn't been there the way they should have been, and that he hoped we could move forward. He said family was important to him. He said the girls were getting older, and he didn't want them to grow up without knowing their grandparents on his side. I asked him what he thought family meant. He said he meant it was important to stay connected, to maintain relationships. I asked him where he'd been when I called him from the driveway in December, 5 years ago, asking if we could come to them, if they could come to us, if they could be anything at all to us in the worst moment of my life. There was a pause. He said he knew that had been hard on all of us. I said, I want to be honest with you, because I think you deserve honesty even if I haven't always gotten it in return. I don't have anger toward you right now. I want to be clear about that. But I also don't have room for you the way you're describing. The people who showed up, the ones who drove down from Kapuskasing the day after I called and slept on a pull-out couch for 2 weeks, the ones who put string lights in a spare bedroom so my grieving daughter would feel welcome, the ones who put their land and their savings into a business so I'd have something of my own, those people are family to me. They have been for 5 years. There isn't a gap left that you fit into. He was quiet for a moment. He said he understood. I said I hoped that was true. The conversation ended without drama. There was no shouting, no accusations, no door slamming in the figurative sense, just a quiet accounting of something that had already happened, long before this phone call. A few weeks later, I drove down to Kapuskasing from the property Gilles and Paulette had chosen in New Liskeard, a town they'd liked for years, on the shores of Lake Timiskaming, close enough to family friends that they wouldn't be isolated, big enough to have the services they'd need as they got older. It was a clean, well-built bungalow with a big yard and a view of the water. Paulette had already started planning a garden. Gilles had already identified a curling club. I had both girls with me. Sophie took exactly 4 minutes to find the best window in the house and declare it hers for reading. Margot walked the yard perimeter and announced that there was space for a proper garden. And possibly, she noted, a small animal rehabilitation setup, which Paulette said she thought was an excellent idea, which is how I ended up having that conversation again. Gilles and I stood on the back porch looking at the water. The sun was low and the lake was doing what lakes do in late autumn in northern Ontario, going silver and still and enormous. He said, "You didn't have to do this." I said, "You know that's not true." He smiled the way he smiles, which is quietly and mostly with his eyes. And then he said he thought Claire had chosen well when she married me. He said it like a plain fact, the way he states most things, and I let myself stand with that for a moment. Inside, Paulette was teaching Margot something at the kitchen counter. I couldn't see what, but I could hear Margot's serious questions and Paulette's patient answers. And Soph calling something to me from the window she'd claimed, and Chester, who'd lived longer than any vet had initially given him reason to expect, was asleep in a patch of sun near the door. I stayed for the weekend. I helped Gilles move furniture and hang pictures, and figure out where the TV aerial got the best signal. I ate Paulette's food, and listened to the girls' voices filling rooms that were new, but would not be strange to them for long. On the drive back Sunday evening, Sophie fell asleep in the passenger seat, and Margot was quietly drawing in the back. It was dark, and the highway was empty, and the trees came close on both sides, the way they do in northern Ontario, black against a sky that still held a little color in the west. I thought about Claire. I thought about the sticky note with the cat drawing. I thought about how grief doesn't leave you. It just becomes something you carry differently over time, distributed across your days instead of crushing them, woven into the texture of a life that is, somehow, still a life. I thought about Thomas's voice on the phone, saying he didn't want the girls to grow up without knowing their grandparents. I thought about what it meant to arrive when you were already too late, and still believe that arrival was the same thing as presence. And then I thought about Gilles saying, "You're here now. That's enough for tonight." On that dark January evening 5 years ago, when I pulled into a snowy driveway with 2 sleeping girls and a tired old dog and nothing else I was sure of. That had been enough. That had been, in the end, everything.